1 minute past midnight, November 15, 1942. A finger hovers over a firing key. 9 16-inch guns, each barrel longer than a school bus, are trained on a target no human eye can see. The target is a battleship. 36,000 tons of steel and fury, cutting through darkness less than 5 miles away. Her crew has no idea they're about to die. No warning. No chance. Just invisible radio waves painting their ship in perfect detail on a glowing screen 8,000 yards away. In 7 minutes, everything changes, not just this battle, not just this war, but the entire future of how nations fight at sea, because tonight, for the first time in human history, a warship will destroy another warship without ever seeing it. Welcome to the night. Admiral Willis Lee proved that a man staring at a radar screen could kill more efficiently than 1,000 trained eyes staring into darkness. The waters around Guadalcanal are a graveyard. They call it Ironbottom Sound. The name isn't poetry. Its inventory, dozens of warships rest on the seafloor, 2,000 feet down, their hulls split open, their crews still inside, American destroyers, Japanese cruisers, the wreckage of empires settling into the MUD.BY. Mid-November 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy owns the night. For 2 decades, they've been perfecting something the Americans can barely comprehend. The ability to fight in pitch darkness. Their destroyer crews train until they can execute torpedo attacks blind. Their lookouts are selected for exceptional night vision, then trained for years in low light conditions. Their optical equipment, rangefinders, binoculars, night glasses, is the finest in the world, and their doctrine is brutal in its simplicity. Close fast, launch torpedoes, illuminate with searchlights, annihilate with gunfire before the enemy knows what's happening. It works. God, does it work? 3 months earlier, at Savo Island, Japanese cruisers appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the night. 32 minutes later, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were on the bottom, over 1,000 men dead. American ships had radar that night, early models, crude by later standards, but functional. The radar operators saw the Japanese coming from miles away. They reported contacts. They gave bearings and ranges, but the commanders didn't trust the little green blips on the screens. They wanted visual confirmation. By the time lookouts spotted muzzles flashes through the darkness, Japanese torpedoes were already slicing through the water. Long lance torpedoes. 24 feet of terror running at 48 knots with a 1,000-pound warhead. No wake. No warning, just sudden, catastrophic death arriving from the black. The battle became a textbook case in how to lose when you have the technology to win. USS Chicago's radar picked up contacts at over 20 miles, but the information crawled up the chain of command like molasses. Radar operators to plotting room to bridge to captain trying to decide if he believes what he's being told. By the time anyone acted, it was too late. The IJN had already won. 2 months later at Cape Esperance, the Americans tried again. This time they used radar to set up an ambush. Rear Admiral Norman Scott positioned his cruisers in column formation, radar tracking Japanese ships approaching in the darkness. When the range closed, Scott ordered a turn that would cross the T, the ultimate tactical advantage, bringing all his guns to bear while the enemy could only fire their forward turrets. It should have been a massacre. It turned into chaos. In the darkness, with ships maneuvering independently, the neat column formation disintegrated into confusion. Ships fired at radar contacts without knowing if they were friendly or enemy. USS Duncan engaged what her crew thought were Japanese vessels. Some were American. USS Boise was caught by Japanese searchlights and pounded mercilessly before friendly ships could intervene. The Americans won. Technically, they sank a heavy cruiser and a destroyer, but the victory felt hollow. The radar advantage had evaporated the moment careful planning met the chaos of combat. Then came November 13th, the first Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. A point-blank brawl in absolute darkness. American cruisers and destroyers stumbling into Japanese battleships at ranges under 3,000 yards, ships firing at muzzle flashes, searchlights sweeping back and forth like the fingers of death. USS Atlanta took 19 hits and a torpedo, limped away, her superstructure shredded. USS Juneau survived the battle only to be torpedoed by a submarine hours later. She didn't just sink, she exploded. The entire ship, and nearly all 700 men aboard, vanished in a single catastrophic detonation. Among the dead, the 5 Sullivan brothers, all serving together. 1 torpedo. 1 family erased. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan died on his bridge. So did Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only 2 American flag officers killed in surface combat during the entire Pacific War, both in one night. The Americans stopped the Japanese bombardment. They saved Henderson Field for one more day, but the cost was unspeakable. 4 destroyers gone. 2 cruisers gone. Multiple ships crippled. Over 700 sailors dead, and intelligence reports said the Japanese were coming back. Admiral Nobutake Kondo was bringing Kirishima south, a battleship, escorted by heavy cruisers and 9 destroyers. Their mission, pulverize Henderson Field into rubble. If the airfield fell, the Marines on Guadalcanal were finished. Without air cover, supply ships couldn't reach them. Without supplies, the Marines couldn't hold, and if Guadalcanal fell, America's first offensive of the Pacific War would collapse. The entire island-hopping strategy would be called into question. Months of fighting, thousands of casualties, all for nothing. Admiral William Halsey had almost nothing left to stop them. The cruiser force was shattered. Most surviving ships were either damaged or critically low on fuel and ammunition. He had one operational carrier, Enterprise, but carrier planes couldn't fight at night. His only option was desperate: strip Enterprise of her battleship escorts and send them into Ironbottom Sound for another night engagement. 2 battleships against an entire Japanese task force. It was suicide, but letting Henderson Field get destroyed was also suicide, just slower. Halsey gave the order. The officer he sent to execute it was different from the others. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee didn't think like most admirals. Most flag officers in 1942 had spent their careers in an era when naval combat meant visual spotting and optical rangefinders, when you looked at the enemy through binoculars and calculated firing solutions with instruments that required steady hands and good light. Radar was interesting, maybe even useful, but unproven, experimental, something to supplement visual systems, not replace them. Willis Lee thought they were all wrong. He'd studied radar for 3 years, not just glanced at reports or attended a few briefings. He'd worked with the engineers developing fire control systems. He'd examined British combat reports from the Atlantic. He'd trained his crews to fight using radar as their primary sensor, not backup, primary. When other admirals said radar was unproven, Lee said radar would decide who controlled the Pacific. Lee was 54 years old, born in Kentucky, graduated Annapolis in 1908. But his expertise wasn't traditional naval warfare. Willis Lee was a marksman. At the 1920 Antwerp Olympics, he won 7 medals in shooting competitions: 0.5 gold, 0.1 silver, 0.1 bronze, the most successful athlete at those games. A record that stood for 60 years. His specialty was long-range rifle shooting, where microscopic variations in wind, temperature, and distance determined hits or misses. Lee understood that hitting distant targets required precise measurement and calculation. Small errors accumulate over range. Wind drift has to be calculated. Temperature affects powder burn rates. Barometric pressure changes bullet trajectory. Lee became expert at measuring all these variables and incorporating them into his shooting. He saw battleship guns the same way. As precision instruments that required attention to every variable: range, speed, wind, ship motion, shell ballistics. Every factor had to be calculated correctly. For decades, navies relied on optical rangefinders to provide the data. An operator looked through 2 lenses separated by several meters, adjusted until the images aligned, then read the range from a scale. It required good visibility, steady hands, and practice. Accuracy was typically 1% of range at best. 10,000 yards. Your error could be 100 yards or more. In darkness, optical rangefinders were nearly useless. Radar measured range by timing radio wave reflections. Radio waves travel at the speed of light. The radar transmits a pulse, measures how long until the echo returns, calculates range from the time delay. The measurement is electronic, instantaneous, unaffected by darkness, smoke, or weather. The Mark III fire control radar on USS Washington could measure range to within 40 yards plus 0.1%. At 10,000 yards, the error was less than 55 yards, twice as accurate as optical rangefinders in daylight, infinitely better at night. Lee didn't just understand this intellectually. He'd reorganized Washington's entire fire control procedure around it. Radar operators worked directly with gun directors and plotting rooms. Information flowed from radar to fire control without layers of skeptical bridge officers delaying or questioning the data. He drilled his crews constantly, track targets on radar, calculate firing solutions from radar data, fire without visual confirmation, trust the electronics. In January 1942, during exercises in Casco Bay, Maine, Washington fired her main battery at night, twice, both times directed entirely by radar. No visual sighting. No optical rangefinding, just radar providing data to the fire control computer. The shells landed close enough to prove the system worked, but proving it in combat, against a shooting enemy, was entirely different. Now Lee would get his chance. November 14, 1942. Intelligence confirms it. Vice Admiral Kondo is bringing a bombardment force to Guadalcanal. Battleship Kirishima, heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, light cruisers Sendai and Nagara. 9 destroyers. Their mission: destroy Henderson Field and land reinforcements. Halsey orders Lee to take Task Force 64 and stop them. Lee has USS Washington, USS South Dakota, and 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwyn. 6 ships, against 1 battleship, 4 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The Japanese have overwhelming numerical superiority, more guns, more torpedoes, better night fighting experience, they know these waters intimately. Lee's only advantage is radar. He intends to use it completely. His plan is elegant in its simplicity: position the force to intercept the Japanese as they approach Guadalcanal, use destroyers as a screen to absorb initial torpedo attacks, keep the battleships back in darkness where Japanese visual spotting can't find them, use radar to track Japanese capital ships. Wait until range is right, then open fire with radar-directed salvos. The plan requires perfect radar performance. Perfect fire co. The plan requires perfect radar performance, perfect fire control calculations, and enough luck to avoid torpedoes and searchlights. Lee accepts these risks. Any other approach means fighting on Japanese terms, and fighting on Japanese terms means losing. Task Force 64 approaches Guadalcanal from the south on the afternoon of November 14. Destroyers, close enough, both sides know a battle is coming. The question is who gains advantage when the shooting starts. At 11 p.m., Lee's force rounds the western tip of Guadalcanal and heads north into Ironbottom Sound. The passage between Guadalcanal and Savo Island is about 8 miles wide, confined space for battleship operations, limited maneuvering room. The water is littered with wrecks from previous battles. Survivors from earlier engagements are still out there on rafts in the darkness, but Lee has no choice. If he stays outside the sound, the Japanese will bombard Henderson unopposed. He has to engage them here. The night is dark. No moon, low clouds blocking starlight, visibility less than a mile. The sea is flat calm with a light chop, hot and humid, temperature around 85 degrees. The smell of jungle vegetation drifts across the water from Guadalcanal. Occasional lightning flashes in distant thunderstorms. Perfect weather for radar. Terrible weather for visual spotting. Washington's SG radar begins picking up contacts beyond Savo at 11:05 p.m. Multiple groups of ships moving south. Lee watches the radar plot display. He counts contacts, more than a dozen vessels in 3 groups. The Japanese bombardment force, arriving on schedule. Lee positions his destroyers in line ahead of the 2 battleships Walk, Benham, Preston, Gwyn. The destroyers will screen against torpedo attacks and engage enemy destroyers. The battleships will hang back, use their radar advantage to engage larger units from distance. Lee sends a message over TBS radio to all ships, short, direct. This is Lee. We're going into a big fight. Keep your heads. Stay alert. Trust your instruments. The technology giving Washington her advantage has a remarkable history. In September 1940, a British technical mission arrived in the United States carrying a black box. Inside was the cavity magnetron. A device that could generate microwave frequency radio waves at power levels useful for radar. British scientists had invented it at Birmingham University. They shared it with America in exchange for American industrial capacity to mass-produce radar systems. The radiation laboratory at MIT received the magnetron in November 1940. Within months, engineers developed the first microwave radar prototypes. The SG surface search radar emerged from this work. It operated at 3000 MHz using a 10 cm wavelength. Revolutionary. Earlier radars used wavelengths measured in meters. The shorter wavelength of the SG provided vastly better resolution. Contacts appeared as distinct points rather than fuzzy blobs. The SG also featured the plant position indicator display. A circular screen 9 inches in diameter showing a map-like view. Washington appeared at the center as a bright dot. North at the top, contacts appeared as bright points of light at their actual bearing and range relative to Washington. The display updated continuously as the antenna rotated at 15 revolutions per minute. An operator could see the entire tactical situation at a glance. Formation positions were obvious. Contact courses could be determined by watching how the points moved. It was intuitive, required less training than older oscilloscope displays. USS Washington received her SG radar during an August 1942 refit. By November, fewer than 50 American warships had them. Still cutting-edge technology, many officers viewed it skeptically. The equipment was complex. Vacuum tubes failed regularly. The antenna motor sometimes jammed. In rough seas, the masthead motion could affect antenna positioning. Trust your instruments. The technology giving Washington her advantage has a remarkable history. In September 1940, a British technical mission arrived in the United States carrying a black box. Inside was the cavity magnetron. A device that could generate microwave frequency radio waves at power levels useful for radar. British scientists had invented it at Birmingham University. They shared it with America in exchange for American industrial capacity to mass-produce radar systems. The radiation laboratory at MIT received the magnetron in November 1940. Within months, engineers developed the first microwave radar prototypes. The SG surface search radar emerged from this work. It operated at 3000 MHz using a 10 cm wavelength, revolutionary. Earlier radars used wavelengths measured in meters. The shorter wavelength of the SG provided vastly better resolution. Contacts appeared as distinct points rather than fuzzy blobs. The SG also featured the plan position indicator display. A circular screen, 9 inches in diameter showing a map-like view. Washington appeared at the center as a bright dot. North at the top, contacts appeared as bright points of light at their actual bearing and range relative to Washington. The display updated continuously as the antenna rotated at 15 revolutions per minute. An operator could see the entire tactical situation at a glance. Formation positions were obvious. Contact courses could be determined by watching how the points moved. It was intuitive. Required less training than older oscilloscope displays. USS Washington received her SG radar during an August 1942 refit. By November, fewer than 50 American warships had them. Still cutting-edge technology, many officers viewed it skeptically. The equipment was complex. Vacuum tubes failed regularly. The antenna motor sometimes jammed. In rough seas, the masthead motion could affect antenna positioning. Officers who'd served entire careers without radar weren't convinced it was worth depending on, but the SG antenna mounted on Washington's forward tower structure gave excellent coverage, maximum range on battleship-sized targets, approximately 30 miles in good conditions, bearing accuracy within 1 degree, range accuracy within 100 yards at maximum range, improving to 50 yards at closer ranges. Impressive specifications, but the real advantage was simpler. Radar worked incomplete. Darkness, visual lookouts were limited to a mile or less. Tonight, radar could see 6 to 8 times farther. Washington also carried Mark III fire control radar on her main battery directors. These radars were specifically designed for gun laying, not search. Focused energy in narrow beams, precise ranging. The Mark III measured range with exceptional accuracy, within 40 yards plus 0.1% of range. At 8,000 yards, total error less than 50 yards, far better than optical rangefinders. The Mark III fed range data to the Mark VIII Rangekeeper, an analog mechanical computer weighing several tons, installed in the plotting room below the armored deck, essentially a room-sized calculator built from gears, cams, and servo motors about 12 feet long, 6 feet wide, 7 feet tall. Required 3 operators. The Rangekeeper accepted inputs for on-ship course and speed, target bearing, target range, target course, target speed, wind direction, wind speed, air temperature, and dozens of other variables affecting shell trajectory. From these inputs, it calculated where to point the guns so shells fired now would intersect the target's future position when they arrived. The calculation had to account for shell flight time, typically 20 to 30 seconds. During that time, both Washington and the target would move. The shells would follow a ballistic arc affected by wind, air density, and Earth's rotation. All these factors continuously recalculated. The Rangekeeper updated as radar provided new range data every few seconds. Gun orders went electronically to the turrets where motors trained the guns in bearing and elevated the barrels. The entire process from radar measurement to gun pointing took seconds. Human rangefinder operators and manual calculators needed minutes, assuming they could see the target at all. But the system had limitations Lee understood perfectly. The Mark III couldn't distinguish shell splashes from target returns. During daylight gunnery, spotters watched where shells landed through optical instruments. They called corrections. Up, down, left, right. The Rangekeeper adjusted, and the next salvo landed closer. In darkness, spotting was impossible. Washington would fire calculated salvos without observing where they landed. The only feedback would be if shells hit and started fires visible to lookouts. Otherwise, Lee would simply trust that radar ranging was accurate and fire control solutions correct. This was the gamble. Lee was betting everything on electronics never fully tested in combat this way. If the radar lost track, guns would fire at empty ocean. If the fire control computer made errors, shells would miss by hundreds of yards. If Japanese ships maneuvered unpredictably, solutions would be wrong by the time shells arrived. Lee accepted these risks. Fighting without radar meant certain blindness. Fighting with radar meant at least having a chance to see and shoot first. In night combat, shooting first usually meant winning. 11:17 p.m. Washington's SG radar detects multiple contacts emerging from behind Savo Island, range 18,000 yards, moving south in 2 groups. Lee orders his formation to battle stations. General quarters has been set for hours, but Lee's message emphasizes contact is imminent. The 4 destroyers are arrayed in column ahead of the battleships, Walk leading. Then Benham, Preston, Gwynn, spaced about 600 yards apart. Washington follows 2,000 yards behind. Gwynn South Dakota is supposed to follow Washington, but Captain Gatch maneuvers independently, and South Dakota's position varies throughout the engagement. Commander Thomas Fraser on Walk has the most advanced radar in the destroyer force. His SG radar picks up the Japanese destroyer screen at 12,000 yards. Fraser recognizes them as enemy destroyers and reports to Lee. He requests permission to launch torpedoes. Destroyers carry 10 torpedoes in 2 quintuple mounts, launching early would let torpedoes run toward the enemy formation. Some might hit. More importantly, Japanese ships detecting incoming torpedoes would maneuver to avoid them, disrupting their formation. Lee refuses. He has a specific reason. He doesn't want American torpedoes and Japanese torpedoes running in the same water space. In darkness, with multiple ships maneuvering, nobody can be certain where all the torpedoes are. An American ship might maneuver to avoid Japanese torpedoes and run into American torpedoes. Instead, friendly fire from torpedoes is a real danger in night combat. Lee orders the destroyers to engage with guns only, maintain screening position, hold fire until the enemy is close, keep formation between Japanese and the battleships, absorb the initial attacks. The destroyers understand their mission. They're expendable. The battleships aren't. The Japanese spot the American destroyers first. Destroyer Ayanami, leading the Japanese screen, detects ships ahead at approximately 11,000 yards. The Japanese have no radar, but their optics are excellent, and their lookouts are rigorously trained. Japanese destroyers carry powerful optical rangefinders and excellent binoculars. The lookouts have been dark adapted for hours. They can see farther than most people think possible. Lieutenant Commander Sato Tomokatsu immediately identifies the contacts as enemy warships. He makes his decision instantly: attack with torpedoes first, illuminate with searchlights, open fire. Ayanami launches a spread of Type 93 torpedoes. The Type 93, called Long Lance by Americans, is the best torpedo in the world. 24 feet long, 0.2 tons, 1,000-pound warhead, powered by oxygen-enriched kerosene which produces no visible wake. American torpedoes leave white trails of bubbles visible for miles. The Long Lance is nearly invisible. Runs at 48 knots with a range of 20 miles. At that speed, American torpedoes typically run at 45 knots with range of 6,000 yards. The Long Lance can hit from 3 times farther at higher speed. A devastating weapon, giving Japanese destroyers huge advantage in night combat. Ayanami launches 8 torpedoes in a spread pattern. They enter the water and accelerate to speed. Will take about 8 minutes to reach the American formation at current range. Sato then orders his searchlight operators to illuminate the lead American destroyer. A powerful searchlight snaps on. Its beam stabs across dark water, finds Walk. Immediately. She's illuminated perfectly. Silhouetted against darkness, Ayanami opens fire with her 5-inch guns at 8,000 yards. Light cruiser Nagara, following behind the destroyer screen, also opens fire. Within seconds, multiple Japanese ships concentrate on the illuminated target. Walk is being hit before Fraser can fully react. Commander Fraser orders hard left rudder to evade torpedoes and returns fire. Walk's 5-inch guns engage Ayanami. Several hits observed on the Japanese destroyer. Ayanami's searchlight goes out, knocked out by American shells, but more Japanese shells are hitting Walk. Forward superstructure struck repeatedly. Fires start on the bridge. The forward 5-inch mount knocked out by direct hit. Fraser launches all 10 torpedoes to clear his tubes and continues firing with remaining guns. The situation is desperate. Walk heavily engaged against multiple enemy ships. Fires spreading. Casualties mounting. At 11:26 p.m., a shell penetrates Walk's forward magazine. The magazine contains several tons of ammunition for the 5-inch guns and smaller weapons. The explosion is catastrophic. The entire forward section of the ship, from bow to bridge, disintegrates in a massive fireball. The blast kills everyone forward instantly. Walk breaks in 2. Forward section sinks immediately. Aft section remains afloat perhaps 30 seconds before capsizing and sinking. Commander Fraser dies instantly. Most of the crew dies in the explosion or goes down with the ship. 76 men killed. Approximately 60 survivors go into the water wearing life jackets. They'll spend hours in darkness waiting for rescue. Preston is second in line, 600 yards behind Walk. Lieutenant Commander Max Storms sees Walk explode ahead. He continues forward toward the enemy. Preston's radar shows multiple Japanese ships. Storms orders his guns to engage nearest contacts. Preston's 5-inch battery opens fire at destroyer Ayanami and light cruiser Nagara. Japanese destroyers Uranami and Shikinami return fire. Preston is hit almost immediately. Multiple shells strike within seconds. One destroys the SG radar antenna. Another penetrates the after engine room. High-pressure steam lines rupture. Superheated steam fills the compartment, killing everyone inside instantly. Preston loses power to after guns and half her propulsion. More shells hit. Pattern consistent with multiple ships firing simultaneously. Bridge struck. killing several officers including the executive officer. Communications cut between bridge and rest of ship. Fires spread amidships where fuel oil tanks have ruptured. The ship is dying. At 11:30 p.m., a Type 93 torpedo slams into Preston's starboard side amidships. The massive explosion breaks the destroyer's keel. The ship's back is literally broken. She begins settling rapidly. Storms orders abandon ship. He stays on the bridge helping men escape. Less than 30 seconds after the abandon ship order, Preston rolls over to starboard and sinks bow first. 116 men die, including Captain Storms. About 90 men survive and go into the water. Benham is third in line. Lieutenant Commander John Taylor sees both lead destroyers sinking ahead. Explosions light up the darkness. Burning fuel oil spreads on the water. Taylor orders emergency turn to starboard to avoid collision with wreckage and survivors. As Benham turns, a Type 93 torpedo strikes her bow, hits at the waterline about 30 feet back from the stem. The explosion is enormous. The entire forward section from bow back to bridge is blown off. Forward gun mounts simply disappear. The bow structure vanishes. Anchor chains, cable lockers, forward crew berthing spaces, forward magazines, all gone. About 60 feet of the ship ceases to exist. But the torpedo hit forward of the main watertight bulkhead. The bulkhead holds. Water rushes in through the destroyed bow section but stops at the bulkhead. Benham's stern section from bridge aft remains intact and watertight. Taylor manages to stabilize the ship. Engines still work, steering functional using the rudder, but Benham can only make 5 knots with her bow gone. Water resistance too great. She's out of the fight. Taylor withdraws south toward Guadalcanal, hoping to beach the ship for emergency repairs. Remarkably, Benham stays afloat all day. November 15th, attempts to reach Guadalcanal but can't make headway. Finally, at 7:38 p.m., after nearly 20 hours afloat with her bow missing, Benham is scuttled by gunfire from USS Gwin. All crew members survive, nobody killed by the torpedo hit. The only good news from the destroyer engagement, Gwin is fourth and last in line. Lieutenant Commander John Fellows sees 3 lead destroyers hit ahead. Explosions and fires indicate the destroyer screen is being overwhelmed. Fellows orders Gwin to engage with all guns and prepare to maneuver independently. Gwin's 5-inch battery fires at multiple Japanese targets. At 11:32 p.m., a Japanese shell hits Gwin's after engine room. The explosion kills several men in engineering spaces and disables one engine, but Gwin remains operational on her remaining engine, can still make about 20 knots. Fellows continues engaging until Lee orders surviving destroyers to withdraw at 12:45 in 15 minutes. The American destroyer screen has been effectively destroyed. 2 destroyers sunk with heavy loss of life. 1 crippled and withdrawing with her bow blown off. 1 damaged but still operational. The Japanese destroyer and cruiser screen executed their night combat doctrine perfectly, engaged aggressively with torpedoes and gunfire, overwhelmed American destroyers with concentrated fire, broke through the screening force, cleared the way for Kirishima and heavy cruisers to engage American battleships. This is exactly what Japanese destroyer doctrine calls for. Destroy the screening units, then allow capital ships to engage enemy battle line. This is exactly the scenario Lee feared but accepted as unavoidable. His destroyers couldn't match Japanese destroyers in night combat. The Japanese have better torpedoes, better training, better tactics, more experience. But Lee positioned his destroyers to absorb the initial attack and protect the battleships. The destroyers did their job at terrible cost. Now it's up to Washington and South Dakota to complete the mission. Everything depends on the battleships using their radar advantage before the Japanese find them. USS South Dakota has maneuvered independently when the destroyer action starts. Captain Thomas Gatch is aggressive, wants to close with the enemy. He moves South Dakota ahead of Washington to engage. At 11:38 p.m., South Dakota's SC air search radar picks up surface contacts at 18,000 yards. The SC is less capable than the SG, but can detect large ships at long range. Gatch orders his main battery to prepare to engage. Gun crews load armor-piercing shells. Fire control team begins tracking contacts. South Dakota is preparing to fire when disaster strikes. South Dakota's electrical system fails. The failure is caused by human error compounded by poor design. During the afternoon, electrical repairs were being conducted. A circuit breaker tripped. The chief engineer manually reset the breaker. While it was still under load, Navy regulations prohibit this because it can cause cascading failures. That's exactly what happens. Resetting the breaker under load causes it to trip again. When it trips, other breakers in the circuit trip. Failures cascade through the electrical distribution system. Within seconds, the entire ship loses power. Everything goes dark. Radar screens go black. Gun directors lose power. Fire control computers shut down. Communications go dead. Ventilation stops. Even emergency Lighting fails in some compartments, damage control teams work frantically in complete darkness trying to restore power. They have flashlights and battle lanterns, but resetting breakers and troubleshooting electrical systems in darkness is nearly impossible. Engineering crew manages to restore partial power within about 5 minutes, but the damage is done. South Dakota's combat capability is shattered at the worst possible moment. Without radar, South Dakota is blind. Lookouts can see the burning American destroyers astern, but can't see Japanese ships ahead. Without fire control power, main battery can't be aimed. Without communications, Captain Gatch can't coordinate with Lee or with his own gun crews. South Dakota continues moving forward on momentum and manual steering, heading directly toward the Japanese force without sensors or working weapons. A nightmare scenario. At 12:01 a.m. Power is partially restored, some radar systems come back online, fire control systems reboot. But the ship has drifted during the power failure. South Dakota has sailed to within 5,000 yards of the Japanese force, far closer than Gatch intended. Japanese cruiser Atago detects the American battleship at close range and illuminates her with a searchlight. The powerful beam finds South Dakota immediately. She's perfectly silhouetted by the burning American destroyers behind her, backlit by the fires. Every Japanese ship in range opens fire. Kirishima fires her main battery of 14-inch guns at range of 5,500 yards, point-blank range for battleship guns. Japanese shells cross the distance in about 8 seconds. Heavy cruisers Atago and Takao fire their 8-inch guns. Light cruiser Sendai fires 6-inch guns. Multiple destroyers fire 5-inch guns. South Dakota is hit by shells of every caliber, struck at least 27 times in 3 minutes, most hits from 8-inch, 6-inch, and 5-inch guns. These shells can't penetrate South Dakota's armored belt or turret faces, but they destroy everything topside. The forward main battery director takes a direct hit from a 14-inch shell. The shell doesn't penetrate the armored director, but the impact destroys the optics and knocks out the crew inside. Men are killed by concussion even though the shell doesn't explode. Radar antennas shattered by shell fragments. Gun mounts hit. Number 3 turret takes an 8-inch shell hit on the barbette, but the shell doesn't penetrate. Fires start in multiple locations. The superstructure is riddled with holes. 39 men killed. 59 wounded. The ship looks like it's been through a scrap metal shredder, but South Dakota's armor does its job. None of the hits penetrate vital spaces. Engines keep running. Ship maintains speed. Main battery turrets can still fire in local control without the directors. But South Dakota is effectively out of the fight. Can't use radar. Can't use centralized fire control. Partially blind and heavily damaged. Captain Gatch orders an emergency turn to starboard to escape the Japanese formation. South Dakota turns hard and disappears back into darkness, heading south away from the enemy. Her sacrifice has achieved one critical result. She's drawn every Japanese ship's attention. While South Dakota is being pounded, USS Washington is invisible in the darkness, tracking Japanese ships on radar, preparing to fire. The Japanese think they've won. In less than 20 minutes, they've destroyed or driven off every American ship they've engaged. 4 destroyers sunk or crippled. 1 battleship damaged and retreating. Admiral Kondo on cruiser Atago congratulates his force on their success. He orders the formation to reform and proceed north to bombard Henderson Field. Primary mission can now proceed unopposed. Japanese commanders don't know USS Washington exists. Every Japanese ship has been focused on the destroyers, and South Dakota Washington has stayed back in darkness, tracking everything on radar, waiting for the perfect moment. In Washington's plotting rooms and directors, radar operators, and fire control teams have complete information. The SG radar shows all Japanese ship positions clearly, returns distinct and easy to track. The Mark III fire control radar on the forward director is locked onto the largest contact, tracking continuously. Radar measures range every few seconds. Mark 8 range keeper computes firing solution continuously, updating as both ships move. Target bearing, target range, target course, and speed estimated from radar plot tracking. Own ship course and speed, wind, all variables fed into the computer. The solution is ready. All turrets loaded with armor-piercing shells, guns trained on target and elevated to calculated angle. Everything ready. Washington just needs permission to fire. Admiral Lee stands on the bridge with Captain Davis. Lee wears a headset connected to radar plot and fire control circuits. He can hear everything the operators are saying. He watches the radar plot display showing the tactical situation. He can see the Japanese battleship clearly on the screen. Range 8,400 yards. The target is moving slowly northwest, heading toward Henderson Field. The Japanese ship has no idea Washington exists. Lee has the perfect setup. His ship is invisible. His target is fully illuminated on radar. His guns are ready. This is the moment everything has been building toward. Years of study, months of training, hours of waiting in darkness, all converging on this single instant. Lee looks at Captain Davis, says simply, "Stand by, Glenn. Here they come." Davis gives the order that changes everything. Main battery, commence firing 1:00 a.m. exactly 1 o'clock in the morning of November 15, 1942. USS Washington opens fire. All 9 16-inch guns and 3 triple turrets fire together in a single massive salvo. The sound is indescribable, the blast pressure so intense it can rupture eardrums. The muzzle flash lights up the entire sky like lightning. The ship shudders and heels slightly to starboard from recoil force. 9 shells weighing 2,700 pounds each fly toward Kirishima at 2,600 feet per second. That's about 1,800 miles per hour. The shells are in the air for approximately 20 seconds while they cover 8,400 yards. Each shell is an armor-piercing projectile. The shell body is forged steel. The nose is hardened to penetrate armor. Inside is about 40 pounds of high explosive with a base detonating fuse. The fuse is designed to explode after penetration, not on impact. The shell will punch through armor plate, travel into the ship, then explode inside where it will cause maximum damage. The ballistic trajectory is carefully calculated. The shells leave Washington's guns at 45 degrees elevation. They arc upward to a peak height of about 20,000 feet, then descend at a steep angle toward the target. The steep angle means shells will penetrate Kirishima's deck armor, which is thinner than her side armor. The Japanese on Kirishima have no warning. They can't see Washington. Their lookouts are focused forward toward Henderson Field. The first indication they have of danger is when 9 shells arrive. The first salvo hits Kirishima's superstructure and forward deck. 2 shells strike the forward superstructure. Both explode. The bridge area is smashed. The rangefinder on top of the bridge tower is destroyed. Fire control equipment is wrecked. Communications lines are cut. Electrical cables are severed. Fires start immediately as fuel lines and hydraulic lines rupture. Kirishima's captain, Sanji Iwabuchi, is on the bridge when the shells hit. He's knocked down by concussion but survives. Most of the bridge crew is killed or wounded. Iwabuchi gets to his feet, tries to assess the damage. Smoke fills the bridge. Electrical power flickers. Communications to other parts of the ship are cut. He can't determine where the firing is coming from. He orders return fire but isn't sure what target to fire at. Gun crews can see muzzle flashes off to the south, but range is unknown. Washington's gun crews are already reloading. Hydraulic rammers push new shells into the breeches. Each shell is mechanically lifted from the magazine below, brought up through the turret structure, and loaded. Powder bags follow. Each gun requires 6 powder bags. Breeches close and lock automatically. The entire loading cycle takes about 30 seconds. Second salvo ready to fire. Fire control solution updated based on latest radar ranging. Washington fires again at 1:00:30. This salvo hits Kirishima forward and amidships. 1 shell penetrates the armored deck near turret number 1, the forwardmost turret. The shell goes through the deck and explodes in a compartment just above the forward magazines. The explosion causes fires and flooding. Damage control parties immediately flood the magazines to prevent detonation. This saves the ship from catastrophic explosion, but it also disables turret number 1. With the magazine flooded, the turret can't be supplied with ammunition. Another shell hits the forward superstructure and destroys the backup fire control position. A third shell hits the foremast and brings down the main fire control director. The director falls onto the deck, crushing men below. Kirishima's main battery fire control is now effectively destroyed. Kirishima tries desperately to return fire. Her aft turrets 3 and 4, are still operational. The local gun captains in those turrets can see muzzle flashes from Washington's guns. They train their turrets toward the flashes and fire. Kirishima gets off several salvos of 14-inch shells at Washington, but without working fire control systems and without radar, Japanese gunners have no accurate range. They estimate Washington is about 10,000 yards away based on brightness of muzzle flashes. They're close. Washington is actually at 8,600 yards, but close isn't good enough. Japanese shells fly toward where Kirishima's gunners think Washington is. The shells pass over Washington's masts, missing by perhaps 200 feet. 1 witness on Washington says, "They must have been mighty close." But close doesn't count. Washington's third salvo fires at 1:01. All 9 guns again. This salvo concentrates amidships. 3 shells hit Kirishima's machinery spaces. 1 shell penetrates the side armor and explodes in the forward engine room. The explosion is devastating. Boilers are ruptured, steam lines burst, turbines are damaged, engineering crew is killed or driven out by superheated steam. Another shell hits near the after engine room with similar results. Kirishima starts losing power. Her speed drops from 20 knots to 15, then to 10. The ship is dying. Fourth salvo fires at 1:01:30. 2 more penetrating hits amidships and aft. 1 shell goes through the deck and explodes in a machinery space near the steering gear. Hydraulic lines that power the steering are destroyed. Kirishima loses steering control. The ship begins turning slowly in a wide circle, unable to control her direction. Another shell destroys the hydraulic pumps that power the training mechanism for turrets 3 and 4. Kirishima's aft main battery is now useless. The turrets can't be trained or elevated. The ship has lost all main battery capability. Fire. Control teams in Washington's plotting rooms watch the radar return. They can see the target is slowing and appears to be turning. Something is clearly wrong with the Japanese ship. Fire control solution is updated for the changing target motion. Fifth salvo fires at 1:02.2 more hits. 1 shell explodes in crew berthing spaces on the port side. Over 100 men are killed instantly. The other shell hits the after superstructure and destroys the emergency steering position. Fires are now burning. From bow to stern, Kirishima is completely ablaze. Sixth salvo fires at 1:02:30.1 massive hit near the waterline on the starboard side. The armor-piercing shell penetrates the side armor and explodes in a compartment already damaged by earlier hits. Water pours in through the hole. The flooding is uncontrollable. Kirishima develops a list to starboard that grows steadily worse. Pumps can't keep up with the flooding. More compartments are being deliberately flooded to prevent magazine explosions. The weight of water is dragging the ship down. In 7 minutes, Washington has fired 75 16-inch shells in 9 salvos. At least 9 shells hit Kirishima in vital areas with devastating effect. Modern analysis of the wreck using sonar surveys suggests 17 to 21 total hits. Many below the waterline where they couldn't be observed during the battle. Washington's 5-inch secondary battery also fires throughout the engagement. The 5-inch guns engage multiple targets including cruisers and destroyers. Approximately 107 5-inch shells are fired. 17 to 20 hit Kirishima. These smaller shells can't penetrate armor, but they destroy everything above deck. Gun mounts knocked out, searchlights shattered, boats and davits destroyed, the superstructure riddled with holes. Men caught in the open are killed by fragments. At 1:07, 7 minutes after opening fire, Lee orders ceasefire. Kirishima is clearly finished dead in the water, burning from multiple fires, listing heavily to starboard, unable to steer or fight. No point wasting ammunition on a sinking ship. Washington has other concerns. Japanese destroyers are launching torpedoes. Lee has to maneuver to avoid them. Type 93 torpedoes are already in the water. Every Japanese destroyer launched their full loadout when they detected Washington's muzzle flashes. Dozens of torpedoes running toward Washington's last known position. The torpedoes run at 48 knots with almost no visible wake, nearly impossible to see on a dark night. Lee orders emergency maneuvers. Hard left rudder, increase speed to 25 knots, then hard right rudder, then left again. Washington zigzags through Ironbottom Sound at high speed. Lookouts on Washington spot torpedo wakes crossing ahead of the ship. More wakes pass astern. Washington is surrounded by torpedoes running in multiple directions, but Lee's constant maneuvering keeps the ship clear. The Japanese aimed at where Washington should have been based on her gun flashes. They can't adjust aim without radar. Lee's zigzag pattern means Washington is never where the torpedoes expect her to be. It's a close call. Several torpedoes pass within 100 yards, but none hit. Washington maneuvers through the torpedo water and emerges without damage. At 3 a.m., Lee orders Task Force 64 to withdraw south. The mission is accomplished. Kirishima is sinking. The Japanese bombardment has been stopped. Henderson Field is safe. The 5-inch guns engage multiple targets including cruisers and destroyers. Approximately 107 5-inch shells are fired. 17 to 20 hit Kirishima. These smaller shells can't penetrate armor, but they destroy everything above deck. Gun mounts knocked out, searchlights shattered, boats and davits destroyed, the superstructure riddled with holes. Men caught in the open are killed by fragments. At 1:07, 7 minutes after opening fire, Lee orders ceasefire. Kirishima is clearly finished dead in the water, burning from multiple fires, listing heavily to starboard, unable to steer or fight. No point wasting ammunition on a sinking ship. Washington has other concerns. Japanese destroyers are launching torpedoes. Lee has to maneuver to avoid them. Type 93 torpedoes are already in the water. Every Japanese destroyer launched their full loadout when they detected Washington's muzzle flashes. Dozens of torpedoes running toward Washington's last known position. The torpedoes run at 48 knots with almost no visible wake, nearly impossible to see on a dark night. Lee orders emergency maneuvers. Hard left rudder, increase speed to 25 knots, then hard right rudder, then left again. Washington zigzags through Ironbottom Sound at high speed. Lookouts on Washington spot torpedo wakes crossing ahead of the ship. More wakes pass astern. Washington is surrounded by torpedoes running in multiple directions, but Lee's constant maneuvering keeps the ship clear. The Japanese aimed at where Washington should have been based on her gun flashes. They can't adjust aim without radar. Lee's zigzag pattern means Washington is never where the torpedoes expect her to be. It's a close call. Several torpedoes pass within 100 yards, but none hit. Washington maneuvers through the torpedo water and emerges without damage. At 3 a.m., Lee orders Task Force 64 to withdraw south. The mission is accomplished. Kirishima is sinking. The Japanese bombardment has been stopped. Henderson Field is safe. No reason to stay and risk further damage. Lee forms up with damaged South Dakota and surviving destroyers and heads back toward Guadalcanal, behind Washington. Kirishima is in her death throes. Japanese destroyers Asagumo and Terazuki come alongside to evacuate survivors. Captain Iwabuchi and most of the crew abandon ship. Over 2,000 men are rescued. Light cruiser Nagara attempts to take Kirishima in tow, but the damage is too severe. The battleship is flooding in multiple compartments. The list to starboard reaches 18 degrees and keeps increasing. The ship is settling by the BOW. At 3:25 a.m., 3 hours and 25 minutes after Washington's first salvo, Kirishima capsizes and sinks. 212 men go down with her. The ship sinks about 7.5 miles northwest of Savo Island in water over 2,000 feet deep. USS Washington has accomplished what no other American battleship will achieve during World War II. She has defeated an enemy battleship in a one-on-one surface engagement. More importantly, she has proven that radar can dominate naval combat. Washington tracked Kirishima on radar for over 20 minutes while remaining invisible to Japanese lookouts. Washington fired 9 salvos of calculated fire without visual spotting and achieved devastating accuracy. The engagement demonstrates that electronics have become more important than eyesight in naval warfare, but understanding the full significance of the victory takes time. Official Navy action reports focus on Admiral Lee's tactical skill and crew training. Captain Davis writes in his report that radar was critical, but many readers interpret this as radar being helpful rather than decisive. Senior officers still think of naval combat in terms of visual range gunfire and torpedo attacks. The idea that ships can fight entirely by electronics is difficult for men trained in traditional methods to fully accept, but Captain Davis understands what happened. In his action report, he makes a statement that proves prophetic. Radar has forced the captain or officer in tactical command to base a greater part of his actions on what he is told rather than what he can see. This is revolutionary. For centuries, naval commanders operated by looking at the enemy and making decisions based on visual information. They could see the enemy formation, they could see where shells were landing, they could see damage on enemy ships. Now they would sit inside ships and make decisions based on electronic displays showing dots and numbers. The nature of naval command has fundamentally changed. But changing doctrine requires more than technology. It requires new training and new organizational structures. In November 1942, these don't exist. They're created in the months after Guadalcanal. Based on lessons from Washington's victory, the Navy begins developing formal procedures for organizing radar information. Before Guadalcanal, radar operators work in scattered locations around ships with no standardized procedures. After Guadalcanal, the Navy begins centralizing radar displays, plotting tables, and communication systems into dedicated spaces. By January 1943, the Navy formally designates these spaces as Combat Information Centers. Trained personnel staff the CIC to maintain situation awareness for the commanding officer. The CIC concept is developed directly from lessons learned at Guadalcanal. The Navy also creates formal training programs for radar operators and CIC personnel. Before Guadalcanal, radar training is minimal and inconsistent. After Guadalcanal, the Navy establishes schools teaching operators how to interpret radar returns, track multiple targets, maintain plots, and communicate effectively with bridge officers and weapons stations. Officers receive training in how to command using radar data as their primary information source. In his action report, he makes a statement that proves prophetic. Radar has forced the captain or officer in tactical command to base a greater part of his actions on what he is told rather than what he can see. This is revolutionary. For centuries, naval commanders operated by looking at the enemy and making decisions based on visual information. They could see the enemy formation, they could see where shells were landing, they could see damage on enemy ships. Now they would sit inside ships and make decisions based on electronic displays showing dots and numbers. The nature of naval command has fundamentally changed. But changing doctrine requires more than technology. It requires new training and new organizational structures. In November 1942, these don't exist. They're created in the months after Guadalcanal. Based on lessons from Washington's victory, the Navy begins developing formal procedures for organizing radar information. Before Guadalcanal, radar operators work in scattered locations around ships with no standardized procedures. After Guadalcanal, the Navy begins centralizing radar displays, plotting tables, and communication systems into dedicated spaces. By January 1943, the Navy formally designates these spaces as Combat Information Centers. Trained personnel staff the CIC to maintain situation awareness for the commanding officer. The CIC concept is developed directly from lessons learned at Guadalcanal. The Navy also creates formal training programs for radar operators and CIC personnel. Before Guadalcanal, radar training is minimal and inconsistent. After Guadalcanal, the Navy establishes schools teaching operators how to interpret radar returns, track multiple targets, maintain plots, and communicate effectively with bridge officers and weapons stations. Officers receive training in how to command using radar data as their primary information source. The curriculum emphasizes that radar isn't a backup to visual systems. It's the primary sensor, especially at night. Tactical doctrine changes fundamentally. Before Guadalcanal, formations are designed around visual signaling and optical fire control. Ships operate in columns or lines where each ship can see the next. After Guadalcanal, formations are designed around radar coverage. Ships with superior radar systems are positioned where they can track the most contacts. Multiple ships coordinate fire. Using radar data shared by radio, task force commanders are required to use ships with the best radar as flagships regardless of which ship is most powerful. This represents a complete inversion of traditional doctrine. The impact becomes clear within a year. In November 1942, American forces are barely holding their own in night battles against the Japanese. By November 1943, Japanese ships avoid night engagements unless they have overwhelming numerical superiority. 3 Night surface actions in the second half of 1943 demonstrate American dominance. At Vela Gulf in August, American destroyers using radar detect Japanese destroyers at long range, maneuver into position, and destroy 3 Japanese destroyers with radar-directed torpedo attacks before the Japanese know American ships are present. At Empress Augusta Bay in November, American cruisers and destroyers defeat a Japanese force using radar-directed gunfire. At Cape St. George in November, American destroyers intercept and destroy 3 Japanese destroyers in a night action entirely controlled by radar. American forces take minimal damage in all 3 engagements. Night combat has become an American advantage. The Japanese try desperately to adapt. They examine wreckage from sunken American ships and find radar equipment. They understand the principle of using radio waves to detect ships, but they're years behind in development. Japanese radar in 1943 is roughly equivalent to American radar in 1941. The equipment is less reliable, has shorter range, and lacks the sophisticated displays that American systems feature. By the time Japan develops working surface search radar comparable to the American SG, it's 1945 and the war is nearly over. Even then, Japanese radar is fitted to only a handful of ships. Japanese commanders also struggle with the psychological impact of fighting an enemy they can't see. For 2 years, Japanese destroyer and cruiser captains have dominated night battles through superior training and aggressive tactics. They've developed confidence that borders on arrogance. Japanese night fighting doctrine is taught throughout the Navy as the gold standard. Now they're being beaten consistently by ships they can't see, firing from ranges where visual spotting is impossible. The confidence built over 20 years of training evaporates. Captains who were aggressive become cautious. Units that pressed attacks begin withdrawing when radar-equipped American ships appear. The psychological shift is as important as the tactical shift. Several experienced Japanese commanders are killed in late 1942 and throughout 1943 trying tactics that worked perfectly before Guadalcanal. They close to short range for torpedo attacks and are destroyed by radar-directed gunfire before they can launch. They try to use searchlights to illuminate targets and are hit by ships firing from beyond searchlight range. They attempt to evade by maneuvering at high speed and are tracked continuously by radar. The fundamental problem is that they're fighting an enemy using a technology they can't detect and can't counter. It's impossible to develop effective tactics against a capability you don't understand. Admiral Lee understands this completely. After the battle, he writes a letter to Admiral Halsey that demonstrates remarkable insight and humility. Lee states that American superiority at Guadalcanal was due almost entirely to radar. He writes explicitly, "We realized then, and it should not be forgotten now, that our entire superiority was due almost entirely to our possession of radar. Certainly we have no edge on the Japs in experience, skill, training, or performance of personnel." Lee is absolutely correct. Japanese crews are superbly trained, Japanese officers have more combat experience, Japanese doctrine is more developed, Japanese equipment, especially torpedoes, is in many ways superior. The only American advantage is radar, and that one advantage is decisive. Lee never receives full public credit for this insight during his lifetime. He's awarded the Navy Cross for his actions at Guadalcanal. The citation praises his leadership and tactical skill. He's promoted to Vice Admiral in 1944 and given command of all fast battleships in the Pacific Fleet. As Commander Battleships Pacific Fleet, he participates in every major campaign from 1943 through 1945. But most histories of Guadalcanal focus on the desperate surface actions of November 12 and 13. Where Admirals Callahan and Scott died leading close-range attacks against overwhelming odds. Those actions have clear heroes and dramatic sacrifice. Lee's victory on November 14 and 15 receives Less attention because it appears too easy. Washington suffers 0 casualties, she isn't even scratched. It doesn't look like the same kind of heroic struggle, but Lee's victory is actually harder than it appears. The decision to trust radar completely is radical. In November 1942. Most admirals consider radar interesting but unproven. They've been trained in an era when visual spotting and optical instruments are the only reliable methods. Radar challenges everything they've learned, Lee bets his entire force on technology that others view skeptically. If the radar had failed, if the data had been wrong, if the fire control solutions had been off by even a few degrees, Washington would have sailed blind into a superior Japanese force and been destroyed. We realized then, and it should not be forgotten now, that our entire superiority was due almost entirely to our possession of radar. Certainly we have no edge on the Japs in experience, skill, training, or performance of personnel. Lee is absolutely correct. Japanese crews are superbly trained, Japanese officers have more combat experience, Japanese doctrine is more developed, Japanese equipment, especially torpedoes, is in many ways superior. The only American advantage is radar, and that one advantage is decisive. Lee never receives full public credit for this insight during his lifetime. He's awarded the Navy Cross for his actions at Guadalcanal. The citation praises his leadership and tactical skill. He's promoted to Vice Admiral in 1944 and given command of all fast battleships in the Pacific Fleet. As Commander Battleship's Pacific Fleet, he participates in every major campaign from 1943 through 1945. But most histories of Guadalcanal focus on the desperate surface actions of November 12 and 13. Where Admirals Callahan and Scott died leading close-range attacks against overwhelming odds. Those actions have clear heroes and dramatic sacrifice. Lee's victory on November 14 and 15 receives less attention because it appears too easy. Washington suffers 0 casualties, she isn't even scratched. It doesn't look like the same kind of heroic struggle, but Lee's victory is actually harder than it appears. The decision to trust radar completely is radical. In November 1942. Most admirals consider radar interesting but unproven. They've been trained in an era when visual spotting and optical instruments are the only reliable methods. Radar challenges everything they've learned, Lee bets his entire force on technology that others view skeptically. If the radar had failed, if the data had been wrong, if the fire control solutions had been off by even a few degrees, Washington would have sailed blind into a superior Japanese force and been destroyed. The consequences of failure would have been catastrophic. Henderson Field would have been destroyed, Guadalcanal would have been lost, the entire Pacific offensive would have stalled. Lee's genius is understanding that radar is more reliable than human vision in darkness, and then having the courage to act on that understanding. That understanding comes from years of study. Lee spends 3 years as Director of Fleet Training studying gunnery systems. He works with engineers developing radar equipment. He reads British reports on radar use in the Atlantic. He attends technical briefings. He trains his crews extensively. He knows the capabilities and limitations of radar better than any flag officer in the Navy. When the moment comes, he trusts his knowledge over conventional wisdom. That kind of leadership is rare in any era. USS Washington remains in service for the duration of the war. She participates in nearly every major Pacific campaign from 1943 onward. She screens fast carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where American carrier aircraft destroy hundreds of Japanese planes in what becomes known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. She's present at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Though she doesn't engage in surface combat, she bombards Japanese positions during the assaults on Iwo Jima in February 1945 and Okinawa in April and May 1945. She's present at the Japanese surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. After the war, Washington is used to transport soldiers home as part of Operation Magic Carpet. She makes 2 trips across the Atlantic in November and December 1945, carrying over 1,600 soldiers from Europe to the United States. She's decommissioned on June 27, 1947 at the New York Navy Yard and placed in the Atlantic Reserve Fleet. She remains in reserve for 13 years while the Navy decides what to do with World War II-era battleships. By 1960, it's clear that battleships have no place in modern naval warfare. Aircraft carriers and guided missiles have made gun-armed surface ships obsolete except for shore bombardment. Washington is stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on June 1, 1960. She's sold for scrap on May 24, 1961 to Lipset Division of Luria Brothers Company in New York. The ship is towed to the scrapyard and systematically dismantled. Her 16-inch guns are cut apart with torches, her armor plates are removed and melted down, her superstructure is dismantled piece by piece. By the end of 1961, USS Washington has ceased to exist except as scrap metal. A few artifacts are preserved before scrapping: the ship's bell, the ship's wheel, some commemorative plaques and deck fittings. These items are held in various naval museums and archives. Captain Glenn Benson Davis remains in the Navy after the war. He's promoted to Rear Admiral and commands Battleship Division 8 during the Marianas Campaign in 1944. He continues advancing and becomes Vice Admiral. He serves as Commandant of the Washington Navy Yard from 1950 to 1952 and as Commandant of the 6th Naval District in Charleston, South Carolina. He retires from the Navy in 1954 after 43 years of service. Davis dies on September 9, 1984 in Bethesda, Maryland at age 92. His contributions to radar doctrine and his partnership with Admiral Lee are recognized by naval historians, but he remains modest about his role. In interviews late in his life, Davis consistently credits Lee's vision and the crew's training for Washington's success. Admiral Willis Augustus Lee never sees the end of the war. On August 25, 1945, 10 days after Japan surrenders, Lee suffers a massive heart attack. He's being ferried in a motor launch across Casco Bay from his shore headquarters to his flagship USS Wyoming, anchored in the harbor off Portland, Maine. Lee collapses in the boat and dies before reaching Wyoming. He's 57 years old. The cause is acute coronary thrombosis, essentially a massive heart attack. 3 years of constant stress commanding battleship forces in combat have taken their toll. Lee has been in combat operations almost continuously from August 1942 through August 1945. He's commanded during some of the most intense naval battles of the war. The physical and mental strain has been enormous. Lee is buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. His grave is marked with a simple white marble headstone. The inscription lists his name, rank of Vice Admiral, and dates of birth and death. It mentions his 7 Olympic medals. It doesn't mention Guadalcanal. It doesn't mention that he proved radar could revolutionize warfare. It doesn't mention that his understanding of technology gave the United States a decisive advantage in the Pacific War. Lee would probably have preferred it that way. He was never interested in glory or recognition. He was interested in solving problems and winning battles. The engagement between USS Washington and Kirishima lasts 7 minutes from first salvo to ceasefire. In that time, Washington fires 75 rounds of 16-inch ammunition and 107 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. The 16-inch shells alone weigh over 100 tons. The propellant charges for those shells weigh another 70 tons. The total ammunition expenditure is approximately $150,000 in 1942. Prices, equivalent to about $2.5 million today. The ammunition cost is insignificant compared to the strategic value of the victory. Washington's victory saves Henderson Field from bombardment. Japanese forces never again seriously attempt to destroy the airfield with naval gunfire. Without Henderson Field, American forces on Guadalcanal can't maintain air superiority. Without air superiority, supplying and reinforcing the Marines would have been nearly impossible. Japanese aircraft and ships would have dominated the waters around Guadalcanal. The campaign might have been lost. If Guadalcanal had been lost, the entire American offensive strategy in the Pacific would have been called into question. The island-hopping campaign toward Japan depends on establishing forward bases. If the first major attempt at establishing a base fails, it would have taken months or years to rebuild the forces and try again. But the greater long-term impact is proving that radar can dominate surface naval combat. Before November 15, 1942, radar is viewed as experimental technology that might be useful in some circumstances. After that night, radar becomes recognized as the foundation of modern naval warfare. Every navy in the world begins intensive radar development programs. Ships are retrofitted with radar. New ships are designed from the keel up with radar as a primary sensor. Tactics and doctrine are rewritten around radar capabilities. The era of visual range combat ends. The era of electronic warfare begins. The transformation happens remarkably quickly. In January 1942, fewer than 100 American warships have any kind of radar. By January 1945, virtually every American warship has multiple radar systems: fire control radar, air search radar, surface search radar, identification systems. Ships carry half a dozen different radar systems, each optimized for different functions. The electronic equipment becomes as important as the guns. Some historians argue that radar is the single most important technology of World War II naval warfare, more important than aircraft carriers or submarines or any weapon system. The lesson from USS Washington's victory isn't ultimately about technology. It's about leadership willing to trust new technology when conventional wisdom says otherwise. Admiral Lee has decades of experience in an era when battleships fight with visual spotting and optical rangefinders. Every instinct developed through 34 years of naval service should tell him to be cautious with experimental electronics. His career has been built on mastering traditional gunnery. He's probably the best gun expert in the Navy. He could have relied on traditional methods because that's what he knows best. Instead, Lee abandons those methods completely. He commits entirely to radar because he's done the intellectual work to understand it. He's studied the engineering principles. He's examined combat reports. He's trained his crews extensively. He's tested the systems in exercises. He knows radar will work because he's verified it through study and practice. When the moment comes in pitch darkness, with destroyers sinking and another battleship crippled and a superior Japanese force approaching, Lee trusts his radar operators and fire control teams to do something unprecedented. He orders Washington to fire at a target nobody can see using data from electronics that most officers don't fully trust. The crews don't let him down. The radar tracks perfectly. The fire control computer calculates accurately. The guns fire precisely. 0.9 salvos in 7 minutes destroy a Japanese battleship. 0.0 American casualties. The victory validates everything Lee believed about radar. It proves that electronics can be more reliable than human senses. It demonstrates that properly integrated technology can overcome numerical inferiority and tactical disadvantage. Most importantly, it shows that innovation succeeds when leaders understand new capabilities deeply enough to trust them completely. That kind of leadership remains rare. Most commanders follow established procedures. They trust proven methods. They avoid risk by doing what has always been done. Innovation requires doing something that hasn't been proven in combat. It requires accepting risk that others won't accept. It requires trusting technology or tactics that haven't been validated by experience. Admiral Lee does all of these things. He organizes his ship around unproven technology. He trains his crew to fight in ways no Navy has fought before. He commits his entire force to a battle plan that depends on radar working perfectly, and he succeeds. The result changes naval warfare forever. Night combat, which had been a Japanese advantage for 2 years, becomes an American advantage almost overnight. The technology that Admiral Lee trusted in November 1942 becomes the foundation for every Navy in the world. The radar displays and fire control computers that seem revolutionary in 1942 evolve into the modern combat systems that control warships today. The lessons Lee demonstrates remain relevant 80 years later. Electronics can provide better information than human senses. Technology properly used can overcome superior numbers, and innovation succeeds when knowledge replaces assumption, when study replaces tradition, and when courage to act differently produces results impossible under old methods. USS Washington's victory deserves to be remembered, not just for what was accomplished that night, but for what it represented. A leader willing to trust new technology. A crew trained to use the technology effectively. A tactical victory that changed strategic reality. A demonstration that the future belongs to those brave enough to see it coming. On a dark night in Ironbottom Sound, Admiral Willis Lee stared at a glowing screen and saw what others couldn't, not just a Japanese battleship, but the entire future of naval warfare, and he had the courage to pull the trigger. That night didn't just save Guadalcanal. It changed everything.